Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to introduce you to a thrilling, action packed story that's not for the faint of heart. This is a one sided showdown where a group of arrogant thugs made the biggest mistake of their lives, picking the wrong man to mess with. Our story takes place at Brooklyn Diner, a small eatery in the heart of the city, where none other than Mike Tyson, the legendary boxer, is enjoying a simple meal. But his moment of peace is soon shattered when a group of four Russian thugs walk in, full of arrogance, looking for trouble, completely unaware that they are playing with a true beast. They move in, taunting him, even grabbing his food, mistaking his silence for weakness. But they are gravely mistaken. In the blink of an eye, the storm is unleashed. One by one, they are taken down in ways they never could have imagined. Bones shatter, bodies slam against the ground, and terror takes hold of their once confident faces as they realize they are completely outmatched. And when the dust settles, Mike Tyson doesn't need to say much, just one simple razor-sharp line. Next time, don't touch my fries. Join me as we dive into this intense, heart-pounding story, a lesson for those foolish enough to challenge a living legend. The Brooklyn Diner stood like an aging sentinel on the bustling street, its neon sign flickering against the darkening sky. Inside, the usual warmth of sizzling grills and clinking silverware filled the air. But tonight, something felt off. The hum of the city outside seemed distant, muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The occasional gust of wind sent loose napkins fluttering across the sidewalk, and the dim yellow glow from the streetlights stretched shadows impossibly long, distorting figures in unnatural ways. At a small outdoor table, Mike Tyson sat alone, his massive frame oddly still, as though carved from stone. He was a man used to chaos, once a god among fighters, feared and respected in equal measure. Now, in this moment, he was just a man enjoying the simple pleasure of a meal, a thick burger, a side of golden fries, and a steaming cup of black coffee. But there was something different about him tonight. His posture, though relaxed, radiated an unsettling stillness, a quiet tension that made the air feel heavier. His hands that had once crushed men's bones in the ring, moved with deliberate precision, lifting his coffee to his lips, taking slow, measured sips. The steam curled upward, but the warmth did nothing to soften the chill settling in the atmosphere. Pedestrians passed by, but no one truly looked at him. Some glanced his way, their gazes lingering for a second too long before instinct urged them to keep walking. A young woman exiting the diner with her to-go order paused, staring at Mike's broad shoulders, her brow furrowing as if she had just sensed something out of place, a ripple in reality itself. She shook it off and hurried down the street. Something unseen coiled in the air around him. Then, the lights flickered, just for a second. A momentary lapse like the diner itself had blinked. A waitress inside, balancing a tray, faltered as the overhead bulbs buzzed and dimmed. Conversation stuttered mid-sentence. A couple sitting by the window looked up from their plates, eyes darting toward the street, sensing the shift but not understanding it. The hum of the city outside seemed to fade further, as if retreating into the background. Mike noticed. His jaw tightened slightly, his fingers resting lightly against the side of his coffee mug. He wasn't afraid, no. Fear was an emotion he had long since conquered. But he was aware. He exhaled slowly. Somewhere beyond the flickering neon glow, trouble was coming. And it was coming for him. Across the street, four figures emerged from the alley, moving with a slow, deliberate pace, their presence casting an unnatural weight upon the night air. Boris led the way, his long coat fluttering slightly as he walked, flanked by his men, Dmitri, Yuri, and Vadim, each one carrying an air of menace that felt just a little too rehearsed, a little too perfect, as if they had done this before. But this time, they had chosen the wrong man. Mike's fingers tensed ever so slightly around his coffee mug. He didn't turn to look at them directly, but he felt them, He always felt them, the kind of men who mistook quiet for weakness, who sought power through fear, never realizing they were prey standing before a lion. The lights flickered again. A strange feeling settled over the diner, thick and suffocating, like a warning. Inside, a waitress dropped a glass, the sharp sound ringing through the air. Mike remained still. He didn't need to turn around. He already knew. They were here. The air shifted, the atmosphere growing dense and electric, as if the night itself knew something wicked was approaching. The Brooklyn Diner, once a sanctuary of casual conversations and the comforting scent of grilled food, now felt like a stage where something dark was about to unfold. Across the street, 4 figures emerged from the alleyway, moving with the cold confidence of hunters who had already decided on their prey. Boris, their leader, walked at the front, his long coat billowing slightly with each step. His scarred face, a map of past violence, twisted into a smirk as his sharp, predatory eyes locked onto Mike Tyson. Behind him, Dmitri, Yuri, and Vadim followed closely, their movements eerily synchronized, like a pack of hyenas circling a lion without realizing the danger they were walking into. Their presence carried an unnatural weight, something that made people on the street instinctively look away, cross to the other side, or disappear into the safety of nearby stores. Even those inside the diner felt it, that inexplicable, creeping sensation at the base of their spine that whispered, "Something bad is about to happen." Boris exhaled, watching the solitary figure at the outdoor table, completely unaware of who he was provoking. He chuckled under his breath, nudging Dmitri. "Look at him," Boris muttered, his thick Russian accent laced with venom. "Sitting there like he owns the place. Another American idiot who doesn't know when to move." Dmitri grinned, his crooked teeth visible under the dim streetlights. "Thinks he's a king," he sneered. "Maybe we should remind him who's really in charge around here." Yuri and Vadim chuckled darkly, their laughter carrying a sinister edge, like something not quite human. The gang moved with calculated arrogance, cutting through the sidewalk crowd without a single glance of concern, as if they expected the world to part for them. And in a way it did. People who had been casually walking suddenly felt the need to turn around, disappear, avoid whatever was about to happen. A street musician, strumming his guitar just a few feet away, faltered in his playing, his fingers missing a chord as the gang passed. His eyes flickered toward Mike Tyson, then back at Boris and his crew, and suddenly he decided to pack up for the night. Something felt wrong. And it wasn't just Boris and his gang, it was the way the shadows moved unnaturally in the flickering neon lights, stretching in ways that didn't make sense. It was the way the air felt heavier, colder, despite the warm summer night. Mike felt them before he saw them. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge their presence. He just took another slow sip of coffee, exhaling through his nose, his mind as still as a deep, dark ocean before a coming storm. That, more than anything, infuriated Boris. Predators thrived on fear. It was what gave them power. It was what fueled them. But this man, this strange, still figure at the table, gave them nothing. No flinch, no hesitation. Just silence. And in that silence, something in the back of Boris's mind whispered a warning. But he ignored it. The gang closed in around the table, their boots scuffing against the pavement, the faint clink of metal, the sound of knives shifting in their pockets, breaking the eerie stillness. Yuri, always the impatient one, kicked a nearby chair out of his way, the sound startling the diner patrons inside. Still, Mike didn't move. Dmitri, unable to stand the lack of reaction, reached forward without thinking, plucking a golden fry from Mike's plate and shoving it into his mouth with a slow, exaggerated chew. "Not bad," he muttered, smirking. Yuri and Vadim laughed, their snickers echoing against the diner walls. And still, nothing from Mike. Boris, growing impatient, leaned down, his face just inches from Mike's. "Hey, big guy," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You look lost. Maybe this isn't your side of town day?" Mike's gaze finally lifted, just for a second. And Boris felt it, a wave of something dark and ancient, pressing against his very soul like the weight of the ocean. His breath caught in his throat. His instincts screamed at him to stop, to walk away, to pretend this moment never happened. But then Dmitri, ever the reckless fool, made the worst mistake of his life. He reached for Mike's burger, and in that instant, the world shifted. Dmitri's hand hovered over Mike's burger, his fingers curling toward the bun, his smirk widening as if he had already won. The moment was slow, stretching unnaturally, like reality itself was hesitating, warning him. But he didn't notice, didn't care. Then it happened. A flash of motion, too fast to track. Mike's hand shot out, a blur of pure power, snapping around Dmitri's wrist like a steel trap. The moment it happened, every single sound in the diner vanished. The clatter of plates, the hum of distant traffic, the low murmur of conversations. Silence. Then, crack. A sickening, wet crunch echoed through the night as bones gave way beneath the ungodly pressure of Mike's grip. Dmitri's smirk shattered into a mask of pure agony. His knees buckled, his breath hitched, and a ragged scream tore from his throat, raw and animalistic. The kind that didn't come from pain alone, but from fear. The other thugs froze, their expressions snapping from amusement to shock. Boris's stomach dropped. Mike hadn't even stood up, hadn't thrown a punch, hadn't even raised his voice. And yet, in an instant, Dmitri, their most reckless, most violent enforcer, was on the ground, writhing like a wounded animal. Mike's grip didn't loosen. His fingers curled tighter. Dmitri's breath hitched into a whimper, his eyes wide, bulging with the realization that he was caught in the grip of something not entirely human. Finally, Mike spoke. His voice was quiet, too quiet. "I gave you a chance." Dmitri barely heard him over the sound of his own ragged, gasping breaths. Inside the diner, the patrons sat in stunned silence. No one moved. No one even breathed. Outside, a streetlight flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the pavement. Yuri, the second in command, shook himself free from his frozen state and took a sharp step forward, reaching for something beneath his jacket. A weapon. A knife. But Mike's gaze snapped to him. A single look. And Yuri stopped. Something in Mike's eyes, something bottomless, endless, predatory, made him hesitate. His fingers hovered just above the knife handle, trembled. Mike's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You can try," he murmured, "if you really want to." Yuri's hand twitched, then fell away from the weapon. Mike released Dmitri's wrist. The moment he let go, Dmitri collapsed to the pavement, cradling his shattered wrist against his chest, his body shaking violently. His entire world had just shifted. He had been in countless street fights, broken bones, spilled blood, but he had never felt this. Power. The kind of power that didn't just hurt you. It broke something inside you. Vadim took a step backward, suddenly very aware that they had made a mistake. But Boris? Boris was too proud, too angry to feel the cold, creeping terror crawling up his spine. His nostrils flared, his breath coming out in short, heavy bursts. His pride was screaming at him. "You're in control. You're the one in charge. No one does this to you." Mike watched him, studied him. Boris's jaw clenched, his hand sliding toward his jacket. His fingers closed around cold steel. A knife. His last mistake. Because in that moment, as Boris's rage clouded his judgment, Mike sighed. Not in fear, not in anger, but in disappointment. Like a lion watching an injured animal limp toward its own death. The shadows twisted as Boris drew the knife, and the diner's lights flickered again. The cold steel of the knife glinted under the flickering neon light as Boris ripped it from his jacket, his hand trembling slightly. Whether from rage or something deeper, something he didn't want to name, he refused to acknowledge. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, his muscles coiled, his instincts screaming at him to strike fast. End this now. But there was a problem. Mike wasn't moving. He just sat there, his coffee cooling in front of him, his massive hands resting calmly on the table, his eyes locked onto Boris's like a predator watching a cornered animal. Something about that stillness, about the way Mike didn't even flinch at the weapon, made something deep inside Boris curl inward, retreating. He snarled, trying to shake the feeling. "You don't know who you're messing with, old man," Boris growled. And then he lunged. The knife cut through the air, fast, brutal, meant to tear flesh, to end things quickly. But it never connected. Because in the space of a heartbeat, Mike wasn't there anymore. 1 second, he was seated. The next, he had shifted, moved so fast it barely registered, and the world slowed. A whisper of motion, a flash of pure, calculated violence. Then, crack, a sickening impact of bone, meeting something harder than it was ever meant to. Boris's entire arm twisted violently as Mike's hand latched onto his wrist with an inhuman grip. The knife clattered to the ground as Boris's face contorted into something primal, something close to a scream. Before he could react, before the shock had fully registered, Mike moved again. His elbow slammed into Boris's ribs with the force of a wrecking ball. The air rushed out of Boris's lungs in a sharp, pained wheeze, his vision momentarily flashing white-hot from the sheer impact. Then, in one fluid motion, Mike grabbed the front of Boris's jacket and lifted him off the ground. Lifted him, like he weighed nothing. Boris's mind barely had time to process the impossibility of it before Mike turned, pivoted, and launched him through the air. His body collided with the hood of a parked car, a sickening thud ringing out into the night. The windshield cracked beneath the impact, spiderwebbing outward, the car's frame groaning from the force. Inside the diner, a waitress screamed. Outside, people froze in place, their faces pale, their eyes locked onto the monstrous display of strength. And then, as if breaking the spell, Yuri and Vadim rushed forward. Their movements were desperate, fueled by fear rather than confidence. Yuri threw a wild punch, but Mike was already moving, ducking beneath it with effortless precision. Then, an uppercut, a single devastating punch, so fast, so brutal, that Yuri never even saw it coming. His feet left the ground, his head snapping back as if he'd been hit by a freight train. By the time he landed, he wasn't conscious anymore. Vadim, eyes wide with horror, tried to grapple Mike from behind. Tried. Mike simply shifted his weight, hooked his arm under Vadim's, and flipped him over his hip like a sack of flour. Vadim hit the pavement hard, the air rushing out of his lungs in a choked gasp. He lay there stunned, his body refusing to move, his mind still trying to catch up to what just happened. Boris, coughing, struggling to sit up on the wrecked car, groaned in agony. He had fought plenty of men before, plenty of tough guys. But this was something else. He looked up, his vision swimming, and saw Mike standing there, calm, unshaken, unbothered. Like this had been nothing more than an inconvenience. Mike exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Then he finally spoke. "You boys should have walked away." And in that moment, Boris knew. They had never stood a chance. Boris lay sprawled across the wrecked hood of the car, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the pain radiating through his body like fire. His ribs ached from the impact, and his arm, useless, twisted unnaturally at the wrist, throbbed with a dull, relentless agony. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, to escape, to forget this night had ever happened. But he couldn't move. The neon light above the Brooklyn diner flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the pavement. The street, once filled with casual passersby, was now deserted, silent, watching. Mike Tyson stood before him, a mountain of stillness, a force of nature. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not vengeful, just cold. Boris had met killers before, had worked with men who took lives for sport. But this wasn't the same. This was something worse. This was a man who didn't even need to try. His hands weren't even balled into fists anymore. He had already won. The fight had never been a fight, just a lesson. A few feet away, Dmitri lay curled on the ground, clutching his shattered wrist, whimpering like a wounded animal. Yuri? out cold. Vadim, flat on his back, unmoving. The entire gang, destroyed in under a minute. The sound of shuffling feet snapped Boris back to the present. A small crowd had gathered just beyond the wreckage, their eyes wide with awe, fear, disbelief. A man pulled out his phone, the glow of the camera recording the aftermath. Someone else whispered, "Holy sh! Is that Mike Tyson?" The realization hit Boris like a second punch to the ribs. He never stood a chance. His breathing was shaky, his pride shattered. He had ruled the streets with fear and violence, but tonight he had been nothing more than prey. Mike took a step forward. The sound of his boots scraping against the pavement made Boris flinch. He felt the weight of Tyson's gaze on him, the sheer presence of the man crushing, suffocating. And then Mike spoke. His voice was low, even, deadly. "Next time, don't touch my fries." The words hung in the air, settling deep into Boris's bones. Mike didn't wait for a response, didn't need one. He simply turned away, his hands slipping into his pockets as he walked toward the diner's door. Calm, unbothered, as if the chaos, the broken bodies, the wrecked car, the scattered weapons, was nothing. The distant wail of sirens finally cut through the silence, their red and blue lights bouncing off the buildings. Boris barely registered them. His world had already ended. Mike Tyson hadn't just beaten him, he had erased him.